Hey guys, today we're continuing answering one question that I picked from social media, and we're going to talk about how to increase ferritin in the context of trying to decrease total body iron when transferrin saturation is high. So in a video a couple days ago, I was covering why transferrin saturation would sometimes be high when iron is low. And the answer is that's exactly what you would expect from an early case of iron overload where it hasn't progressed to the point where it's typically diagnosed at because of the breakdown in signaling between the high transferrin saturation and the response to that, which is to decrease iron uptake in the intestines and to increase ferritin, because ferritin protects, despite the fact that ferritin is high under conditions of severe iron overload that are bad for you. It's the severe iron overload that's bad for you, and the high ferritin is a protective response to the iron to direct the iron into storage and to shield it from contributing to the production of the hydroxyl radical, which is a much more severely destructive reactive oxygen species than most of the other ones in the body, and to protect it from feeding pathogens in the context of an infection. And so someone, and by the way, I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. Don't take anything in this without seeking medical attention and discussing it with your doctor first. And then also see the description in chat for some ways you can support my work. But so here's the question. This question was on the Facebook version of this video that came out about why iron saturation would be high, but ferritin would be low in a case of early iron overload. And I'm answering Joan Jarvis's question, which is, so I have hereditary hemochromatosis, been in maintenance for 12 plus years with regular donations. Based on your video chat today, I have very low ferritin, but now my saturation is around 70%. I feel great after donating, trying to work out how to get saturation down without depleting my ferritin. Have you come across this? And this is, this is basically just a relatively strong case of what I was talking about before. I didn't really explain what to do about it before. I just said that's what you would expect in that situation. So this raises a couple questions, right? Because first of all, she's saying, and again, I'm going to emphasize that, Joan, I'm not your doctor, so please take this purely as educational and informational and talk to your doctor about it. So the question is, well, actually, she doesn't say, I thought she said, she just says, I have very low ferritin. I mistakenly thought she said how low it was. So I guess the first question would be, how low is the ferritin? But it's also a question of, should you even be treating the ferritin? Because what is ferritin? Well, first of all, ferritin, when you measure it in serum, is serum ferritin. And although we know what it responds to and we know what it indicates as a biomarker, as I pointed out, like in the most recent edition of the Iron chapter of Modern Nutrition and Health and Disease, they have a whole section on how no one really knows where serum ferritin comes from. We know a lot about what regulates its production inside a cell. And there's a lot of mechanistic details about that, but essentially high intracellular iron levels increase ferritin production. But, how it even gets into serum is sort of speculation. So we can sort of guess that your intracellular ferritin levels are lower if your serum ferritin levels are lower, but we can't really know that. And then on top of that, what does ferritin do? Well, probably ferritin does some things that I don't know about that is in the literature somewhere, and probably ferritin does some things that we collectively don't know about yet because no one's done the research. But as far as we know now, ferritin is basically storing the iron to protect it from causing harm. So, is it a problem that ferritin gets too low from blood donation? Well, what blood donation is doing is selectively removing iron by removing red blood cells and then taking mostly a few days, but completely 4 to 8 weeks to shift the high free iron or the high stored iron into red blood cell protection, which also protects the iron. And so what's dangerous in the case of iron overload is high free iron levels. So you may decrease your ferritin by decreasing your iron overload by donating blood, but you're not going to increase your iron overload by donating blood. In other words, the metric that we care about in iron overload is unprotected iron, iron that is not protected by being in ferritin, that is not protected by being in red blood cell hemoglobin, that is not protected by being in iron-dependent enzymes such as cytochrome P450s that stimulate detoxification, such as thyroid peroxidase, which makes thyroid hormone, such as the iron sulfur clusters of the electron transport chain, which make or break your ability to use food to produce energy. And so if your ferritin drops because you reduced your iron overload, it's not clear that that's a problem. So I'm not sure we should be treating ferritin. Would be my response to that. Which would be my first leg of that response. Second thing is, she's saying she feels better when she donates blood, which suggests that she's getting a net health benefit from it. Now, I can't prove that, but the real metric that you want to be protecting against is iron deficiency anemia and hypothyroidism. And you also want to protect against decreased cytochrome P450 liver detoxification, but that's harder to measure. You also want to protect against dysfunctional electron transport chain, but that's harder to measure. But we have really good markers for thyroid function and hemoglobin levels. So the real metrics that you should be avoiding causing abnormalities in are red blood cell and hemoglobin abnormalities on a complete blood count and thyroid abnormalities on a thyroid panel. So if your thyroid's great and your CBC is great and you feel great when you donate blood, then I'm totally unconvinced that that ferritin dropping is actually a problem. More to the point, and this is just my suspicion and working model of the way I think about it, and I'm not a doctor, so don't take this as medical advice, but I kind of think like if someone is looking at ferritin levels and correlations with outcomes, it seems to me that if you're dropping under 150, you are at somewhat increased risk on average of having lower athletic performance or not feeling as well. And if you're dropping under 60, you're at somewhat higher increased level of being anemic. But conversely, if you have a case of iron overload, you're probably at much better position to be removing iron from your body if you're like under 20. So I kind of think that like my working model is, if your history is someone who is predisposed to iron deficiency anemia, then you should be trying to proactively keep your ferritin on the higher side in the 60 to 150-ish range. But if you have hereditary hemochromatosis, you probably don't want your ferritin anywhere near 60 if you're currently in the state of improving your health by reducing it lower than that. And I don't know if this is really ironed out, but I'm not sure it's not a good bias to try to be reducing it under 20. All that is predicated, of course, on making sure that low iron doesn't hurt your health. And so you don't want to go anemic, and you don't want to go hypothyroid, and you don't want to start feeling worse in response to blood donation. So I'm not sure there's something to treat in the ferritin itself. That's sort of the first leg of my response. Then the second leg of my response would be, I'm not sure if your saturation is really 70%. So, when the saturation is wildly high like that, then I think you want to stop using well, you want to stop completely relying on iron saturation from an iron panel to tell you what your estimated transferrin saturation is. So as I mentioned in the previous video, iron saturation from an iron panel is basically um, a calculation that is cheaper to produce of what we think your transferrin saturation is. And that can be thrown off by things such as, is your albumin low? And if your albumin is low, that's going to make it look like your total iron binding capacity is low, which is, well, actually, it is going to make your total iron binding capacity low because albumin is a portion of your total iron binding capacity. And then it's going to raise your iron saturation, but it's not that doesn't tell you anything about whether your transferrin saturation is higher. And in which case the problem might be you need to eat more protein. I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go to testing nutritional status, the ultimate cheat sheet. This is newly released in version 1.3 as of a few weeks ago. And we're going to go down to the iron section, and we're going to go down to the blood markers for iron. Excuse me. And so if you go under iron saturation, it says iron saturation can be found on an iron panel and is an estimate of transferrin saturation. Transferrin saturation can be calculated directly by getting the iron panel and the serum transferrin at the same time. To calculate it, divide the serum iron from the iron panel by the serum transferrin and multiply it by 70.9%, which is the equivalent of multiplying it by 0.709. And I go on to say it's always preferable to use transferrin saturation over iron saturation because iron saturation often underestimates transferrin saturation, and sometimes the gap is large. But conversely, it could also overestimate it depending on which way other factors that bind iron, especially albumin, are fluctuating. And I suggest, as a general rule, at a minimum, test both iron saturation and transferrin saturation 1 or 2 times to determine whether iron saturation is a good proxy for transferrin saturation in your specific case, and only substitute the former if it appears reliable. Ideally, your transferrin saturation between 30 to 40%, and that all the other stuff is what I covered in the last video. So, leg 2 of my answer is actually measure your transferrin saturation to make sure that your iron saturation isn't throwing you off. Because you would expect it to be high in a case of hemochromatosis, especially if the ferritin is low. But it might not be as high as 70%. And if it is as high as 70%, then your assessment of the original problem is correct. But if it's not, then you probably have something else going on, such as your albumin might be low. And if your albumin is low, you might want to look at reasons that the albumin is low, which could be a number of things. But nutritionally, you might need to increase your protein intake. Third leg of this response is, let's assume that the transferrin saturation is that high and the ferritin is very low. Let's assume that the problem is as originally stated. And let's not look at it from the perspective of we want to treat the ferritin because we're worried about it running deficient. But we're looking at it instead from the perspective that although we're not trying to treat the ferritin per se, and we're not afraid of it going down in response to blood donation, we do want to bump it up relative to the transferrin saturation because that is a very rough and crude index of the degree of free iron mediated damage. So if the higher transferrin saturation is and the lower ferritin is, presumably we can guess that you have a higher amount of free iron that's going to cause more damage. And if we can get ferritin up, that's going to have protective effects. So I'm going to share my screen again and go back to a couple slides that I shared yesterday when I was talking about green tea. So when I was talking about green tea, I was talking about the way that antioxidant polyphenols regulate NRF2 signaling. And NRF2 is a transcription factor that is held in the cytosol bound to KEAP1. KEAP actually stands for something, but it's sort of an interesting mnemonic that KEAP1 keeps NRF2 in the cytosol. And keep one has reduced sulfhydryl groups, which are sulfur-based groups on it that act as signaling detectors. And when keep one is bound to NRF2, it directs NRF2 into the proteasome where it is degraded. And so NRF2 is always being produced, but it's always being kept in the cytosol by keep one by default instead of going to the nucleus, and it's being constantly degraded in the proteasome. So if you have an oxidant that oxidizes the signaling sulfurs on keep one, then that stops keep one from keeping NRF2 in the cytosol and from directing it into degradation, and allows it to go into the nucleus, where it will bind to the antioxidant response element and stimulate antioxidant defense gene expression by making mRNA transcripts that will go into the ribosome and be synthesized into protein in the endoplasmic reticulum, and then made as proteins and go to wherever they're supposed to go in the cell or secreted. Ferritin has both fates. Ferritin both winds up in the cell, and some of it winds up secreted. Now, notice that this is an oxidant that is causing antioxidant response element gene expression. The reason that we have this apparent discrepancy or paradox between an oxidant doing something that mediates an antioxidant response is because actually a lot of the things that we call antioxidants are oxidants. And so in yesterday's video, I was talking about green tea. EGCG can act as an oxidant and oxidize sulfhydryl groups, and at high concentrations, it causes oxidative stress that destroys cells. So at low, part of the reason these things don't end up in high concentrations that kill cells in most cases is because we treat them as toxins. And actually, maybe I have. Do I have that here? I think I do have that here. So when you eat a vegetable and you have polyphenols, they are treated as xenobiotics by your intestines and by your liver. First by your intestines, then by your liver. And so they are oxidized by detoxification enzymes and conjugated through methylation, sulfation, glucuronidation, etc. And they're conjugated to make them tagged for removal from the body, and they're transported out of the cell. And so if this is in the intestines, they're excreted in the feces. If it's in the liver, they're excreted in the bile, and the bile will take them into the intestines, and some of that will wind up in the feces. Some will reabsorb into the systemic circulation, go out in the urine. But we detoxify these things at very high rates. And so here's just an example of a study results where epicatechin, which is one of the less abundant green tea catechins, and is an example of a polyphenol, was given, and less than half the initial dose was absorbed. 3.4% of the dose was absorbed and immediately spit out by the intestines. What was absorbed into the systemic absorption, half of it was excreted into the bile in the first 24 hours. Only about 20% of the total dose actually reached the general circulation. So this half is going to the liver first and then going back into the bile, and it's never seeing the blood. Only 20% is seeing the blood, and of this, nearly a quarter of it was excreted in the urine within the first 24 hours, and almost all of this 15% that remained in the body for more than 24 hours was present as sulfated, glucuronidated, or methylated detoxification products. So these things are treated as toxins by the body, and that's why yesterday I showed you this. In small amounts, they promote glutathione synthesis. In large amounts, this is a cellular study, they cause lipid peroxidation. They're going to wind up killing the cell. Well, this is a cell study. This doesn't happen when you drink a cup of green tea. When you drink a cup of green tea, for example, a very small amount gets into the body and is mostly present as methylated, glucuronidated, or sulfated detoxification products. And so even if you take a lot of them, usually you just get the small amount that increases glutathione synthesis, making it a well-behaved toxin. So the reason I'm bringing up this in the context of iron is to show you the slide that I showed you yesterday, which is that oxidative stress, cigarette smoking, xenobiotics, air pollutants, drugs, and polyphenols all activate which is thousands of chemicals that go way beyond the catechins in green tea. This is, fruits and vegetables in general are very high in polyphenols, and there's also polyphenols in many other foods. All of these activate NRF2 signaling, And that doesn't just increase antioxidant synthesis, such as glutathione. It also increases phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification enzymes, including glutathione transferase, and antioxidant enzymes, heat shock proteins, and glycation defense enzymes. But what does it also do? It increases ferritin. Now, remember, things can be toxic and cause net damage even though they activate NRF2. And so iron overload is going to be a good example of that. Iron overload is going to activate NRF2, but it's going to cause more toxicity than it activates NRF2. And so that's why you can have iron overload even if your ferritin is relatively low. And if your ferritin eventually reaches 1,000, you have a lot more iron overload mediated toxicity than you have NRF2 mediated ferritin expression. So you still wind up with a lot of net damage and toxicity. But if you use polyphenols that stimulate NRF2, then you'll get more NRF2 activation than you will get toxicity and net protection and hormesis. And this net protection doesn't just apply to the polyphenol, it applies to everything else that might cause net toxicity, such as iron. So the third leg of what I would be saying is, if you assume that you've assessed the problem and you actually have a legit case of very high transferrin saturation and low ferritin. Again, I'm not a medical doctor and don't take this as medical advice. This is just education. Talk to your doctor about it. But what I would be looking at it as a first way to try to increase the protective effects of ferritin would be to stimulate the NRF2 pathway with products designed to do that. So milk thistle's designed to do that. Protandem's a proprietary, highly marketed thing that's meant to do that. Sulforaphane will do that. And, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables will do that. But, if I were looking at this, I would think, okay, what's measurable? What is this measurable against? And I think that, whether it increases your ferritin is one index of it, but whether you've actually, ferritin is not a specific NRF2 response, because it also increases in response to inflammation and iron overload. So I'd be looking at something more specific to NRF2 response. And so something like the Genova Oxidative Stress 2.0 blood panel would probably be a better way to look at that, because, certainly I would look at whether it's effective at increasing ferritin, but in terms of whether you're maxing out or plateauing your ability to stimulate more NRF2 response, then theoretically, increased levels of glutathione and increased levels of all the antioxidant enzymes in that panel is what you should see in response to the NRF2 stimulating intervention, which again would be diet high in fruits and vegetables, polyphenolic herbal extracts that are designed to promote detoxification, such as milk thistle or sulforaphane, any of those things. And that you in theory, you should see glutathione synthesis and antioxidant enzymes sort of maxing out as you approach your maximal stimulation of NRF2 from that intervention. And hopefully that correlates with increasing the ferritin in that case. But I would come back to the fact that I wouldn't be trying to treat the ferritin, and I wouldn't be using the ferritin as the metric of whether to stop donating blood. Because especially if you feel better and your thyroid function is great and your CBC looks great, then the ferritin dropping is probably not itself a bad thing. If anything, it's sort of kind of the, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm having a brain fart here. Anyway, it's collateral damage. That's what I was thinking of. It's sort of the collateral damage of the net benefit of decreasing iron overload. And you can mitigate that collateral damage by trying to stimulate the NRF2 pathway. So that's all I have to say on this. I'm going to look at the live chat and see if there's any highly relevant questions for clarification or elaboration here. Chris Inklin says lactoferrin could help with that, right? Well, lactoferrin would help you bind iron. And so it might reduce iron overload. I'm not sure if lactoferrin has an effect on NRF2. If it does, I didn't know about it. It might. I'd have to look that up. But lactoferrin also will decrease inflammation in people with elevated IL-6, and that's how it helps helps resolve anemia in women with anemia of chronic disease. But that's sort of doing the opposite. It's if you decrease IL-6 by decreasing inflammation, you're going to decrease the ferritin response, not increase it. So it might help sort of act as a gentle chelator of iron, but it's probably not going to do anything to your ferritin versus transferrin saturation flux unless your inflammation is high. And IL-6 rather than CRP would be the primary metric to look at for that. But if it does do anything to that flux, it's probably going to do the opposite of what we're trying to talk about today. Betty Ramos says, what about iron supplementation overload? I'm not sure what you mean. Certainly, if you're trying to decrease iron overload, you don't want to supplement with iron. But generally speaking, if you don't have a problem regulating iron intake at the intestinal level, if you're not in the 8% of people globally who have that problem, in theory, you should be able to supplement iron at pretty reasonable doses that aren't wildly outside the range of what's recommended on the label, and not get iron overload. But if you have iron overload from that, then the principles are still the same. You want to remove it from the body by removing blood. C-Hut, very sorry about the delay in the book. If you're not anyone who pre-ordered the book, if you're really mad about it being a little bit late, a lot late, sorry, we can give you a refund, but it is coming, and I think it's going to be a lot better than you expected. So if you are willing to be patient about it, I appreciate it. Chris, okay, I already got to that. Betty Ramos says, where can we get the cheat sheet? Well, you can go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/cheat sheet. And then in the link that I put in the description for the support page, there's also a link to the cheat sheet on that as well. Erica says, but green tea interferes with iron absorption. Well, as I covered yesterday, green tea interferes with everything absorption. And the solution to that is just take it on an empty stomach. But I wasn't specifically talking about green tea. I'm talking about any polyphenolic compound that stimulates NRF2. Erica says low ferritin levels equals hair. Well, there's pretty good evidence that iron deficiency causes hair loss. And I'm not sure if that's a specific effect of iron deficiency or if it's actually a thyroid issue, because iron deficiency causes hypothyroidism. But that doesn't mean that low ferritin causes hair loss. So that's just completely confusing a biomarker with a biochemical effect. The fact that something in your blood correlates with a treatment effect or identification of a diagnosis does not at all mean that thing being low or high is what causes the signs and symptoms that result from it. So iron deficiency can cause hair loss. Repleting iron deficiency can reverse hair loss, but that doesn't mean that low ferritin causes hair loss. And while ferritin might usually be a good index of that, that doesn't mean that ferritin is going to be a good index of it in the case of someone with hereditary hemochromatosis whose transferrin saturation is 70% and who improves their health consistently when they remove iron from their body. Gwyn Bleed says alpha-lipoic acid could bind it. That might be true. I haven't looked at that. It's sulfur containing. Maybe it could bind a lot of things. That makes sense. But I don't think chelating iron is. So first of all, generally things that chelate iron are not specific to chelating iron. And I watched a video of an expert that someone posted on my Twitter who was doing a review of the current research on hereditary hemochromatosis. And he said the next line pharmaceuticals that are coming out are going to be iron-specific chelators. But I think those are in experimental phase. But right now, anything that chelates iron is going to chelate other things. So I think chelating iron is sort of the last, it's the last resort of what you would want to do, because you're going to wind up having a very high risk of creating other deficiencies if you're trying to chelate. Whereas blood donation removes iron with enormous specificity, because 90% of your iron is stored in your red blood cells, and that's not true of any other nutrient. And so, but in any case, here I think the issue is not really how do we chelate iron. The issue is how do we increase ferritin. And so chelating iron is not going to increase ferritin. It's going to, I guess it could compensate for low ferritin, but I think it would be better to increase the ferritin through gene expression, like I was outlining in this video, if we could do that. Betty Ramos says previous vegan and anemic took supplements of iron for 3 years. Okay, well, maybe that's a good thing if you're reversing anemia. Protein says, is avoiding ascorbate-rich foods with iron-rich foods actually required to minimize iron absorption? No, but that's contextual. So if you have normal iron metabolism, then you don't need anything to minimize iron absorption, because when you have enough iron, you will decrease ferroportin in the intestines through iron-mediated gene expression, and you will not need to do anything to manage your iron absorption. But if you're in the 8% of people who, like me, who have some version of dysfunction in regulating iron absorption, then yeah, you can decrease the combination of plant-based iron and vitamin C in order to minimize iron absorption. But I still think it's, you can spend all day long managing your diet every single day, or once every 2 months, you can donate blood with up to a half hour of commuting time and a half hour at the place, another half hour of commuting time max. So if I can more efficiently and specifically manage something with a 1 to 2 hour event every 2 months, I would much rather do that than micromanage my diet all day, every day. Erica, thyroid is so contextual. I can't open that can of worms here. That's highly dependent on, why you need to nourish your thyroid. Certainly, iodine, protein, antioxidant support, many things are needed for managing thyroid. All right. That's it for today. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you to everyone who asked additional questions. I got to go. This was great. Hopefully